Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of today's webinar, as you can see by the rather long title there, is promoting anti-racism in schools, but specifically looking at that from the perspective of governance and how we help prepare all pupils for life in modern Britain. This is your webinar this morning, so please do ask questions as we're going through. We've got a very, very large number of people joining us today, which is fantastic, but does mean that we may not be able to answer all the questions, but we'll certainly do our level best. I'm hoping everybody can actually hear me. If you can locate the little hand icon on your go-to toolbar and just click on that. If you can hear okay, that would be very helpful just before we kick off. Lovely, and I can see quite a few people raising their hands now. Fantastic. Good stuff. Okay, I will put your hands down for you, and no more ado, we'll kick off. A very warm welcome. I'm Steve Barker. I'm the person on the left-hand side of the slide in front of you at this point in time, and I'm joined this morning by Linda Waghorn, my colleague, who's on the line down in the deepest parts of Sussex. How are you, Linda?
Good morning, everyone.
Excellent. And as I say, between us, we'll guide you through this webinar this morning, but please do keep any questions or comments that you've got coming, and we'll do our level best to be able to respond to those for you. The focus of today's webinar is really to, over everything else, just to be a little bit thought-provoking. What we want to do is encourage you as governors and trustees to think about, in the light of recent events that have gone on in the world, to think about how our schools ensure that what we're doing in terms of provision positively demonstrates to all pupils that Black lives do matter in 2020 and of course going forward into future years, etc. So what we want to do is share some thoughts, share some data with you that perhaps paints a picture at the moment and then gets us all to reflect on what we're doing right now in our own governing boards to think about how perhaps we can change that picture. I want to start off with just a few facts really for you, if we may, and those facts come from a series of sources and reports, as you can see on this slide that's in front of you now. First one is that children from Black and mixed white and Black Caribbean backgrounds are far more likely in this country, based on the evidence that was presented to the Timpson report presented to Parliament last year, to experience exclusion in schools than any other group of pupils. Next one is that Black and minority ethnic students at university achieve less well compared to school, and they fare far worse when it comes to the labour market. Now, that's a report that was again published last year, coming out of the Runnymede Trust, which is a body that it's a charitable organisation that engages in a lot of research on a whole range of issues. And certainly, they make the point that progress has been made in terms of students from Black and ethnic minorities getting into university. That, you know, the access there has improved over time. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of their progress, they may have done really well at school, but they don't progress as well in university, and getting jobs, etc., is proving more of a challenge. And then the last fact that we've got there: 51% of boys in young offender institutes and young adult men between the ages of 18 and 21 in institutions at the moment come from ethnic minority backgrounds, specifically Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. And that's the latest data from Her Majesty's Chief Inspection of Prisons. So that's just to provide a little bit of a backdrop. I don't want to make any more comment about those facts, other than to say clearly there is something here at the moment that says, as a society, perhaps things are not as equal as we would actually want them to be.
And I think it's worth saying there that there is a connection also between those children who have experienced permanent exclusion and those who later go on through the criminal justice system. So it starts at that stage. Indeed.
I just want to very briefly say a couple of words about unconscious bias here. Unconscious bias is, of course, a concept that many of us will be aware of, but some people may not be. it is very real, and the idea of unconscious bias is that when we're making decisions, when we're thinking as individuals, our unconscious mind actually processes information a lot faster and actually influences our thinking, influences our decision making, more than perhaps the rational mind ordinarily would. And things like our background, our cultural environment, our personal experiences, all of those actually have an impact on unconscious bias. And one of the things that we need to be very careful of is that we don't let unconscious bias influence what happens in our schools, influence what's happening in the classroom, influence the way in which teachers, other staff in schools are making decisions, making judgments, etc. That's easy to say, it's a lot harder to do. There's a lot of information around. The Royal Society for Arts, the RSA, have got a very good little video on their website, which we've given you a link to, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a few moments. But one of the things that they say at the end of the video, in terms of tips on how we can perhaps think about unconscious bias and avoid it having perhaps the impact that it might ordinarily do, and you can see on this slide here, all of these factors here, and this slide is supposed to signify the idea that we all see the world in slightly different ways, and the ways in which we see the world are influenced by our own background and that cultural environment and our own experiences as individuals. But that has an impact on age, gender, sexuality, disability, race, skin color, etc., etc. All of those things can be, and very often are, influenced by unconscious bias. And this is just I don't expect anybody to read this, it looks like a little bit of an eye test, but this is just a place marker to really get you to think about unconscious bias. And as I say, I've put the link to this particular document in the PowerPoint for you so that you can actually follow this up if you would like to. And this is all about how the Royal Society looked at getting rid of unconscious bias as far as they possibly could from their recruitment processes. There are lots of other resources available, and again, I don't want to make this session all about unconscious bias, but I found a video clip on YouTube. There's a TED Talks, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with TED Talks. There's one given by a lady called Valerie Alexander from the US, and she does this very quick little scenario building that actually makes people ponder on it. I'd just like to share it with you now, if I may. And it calls for everybody to close their eyes. So just close your eyes and imagine, is how it starts out. So if you close your eyes and imagine right now that you go out to dinner this evening, and you go out to dinner in your favorite restaurant, and you have a really lovely meal, probably one of the best meals you've had in a long time, notwithstanding lockdown, of course. And on the table next to you, there's a couple celebrating their anniversary. You get talking, you share drinks, you have a lovely evening. Tomorrow you get up and you go to the airport and you fly off to Paris because you're going to a meeting, and the pilot greets you at the door of the aeroplane and wishes you a good and a safe flight. You're feeling all's well with the world. You go to the conference and it's opened by the CEO of a multinational corporation. Stop there and pause. Now ask yourself 3 questions. Were the couple same sex? Was the pilot black? And was the CEO a woman? And probably there'll be some of you that have different answers. It doesn't matter what the answer is, but the point is most of us will find that our answers to that fall into the stereotypes that our own personal experiences actually put in front of us.
I think at the other end of the spectrum of that, Steve, was the recent Channel 4 programme on the school that tried to change racism.
Absolutely.
And the children's perception of their own place in the world and their unconscious bias, particularly the white children in the school, it shocked them when the very simple things that they took for granted from their own perspective were challenged in very simple ways. And I thought that was quite powerful to see those young people begin to reflect on things that they'd never really had an opportunity or been in a position to have challenged in the past.
Absolutely, and I think the idea is that with all aspects of unconscious bias, unless we recognise that unconscious bias exists, not just in ourselves as governors, but in our colleagues in schools, etc., then there is always the scope that it will influence. And we've got a lot of questions coming through at the moment, all on a very similar theme, but two particular ones, Javian and Thomas, asking the question, what resources are out there to actually help train people in schools to recognise unconscious bias? There's a whole host of them, and so we've put a couple of references in the penultimate slide this morning. One is to this RSA document, which I think is actually a very good one. There's a nice little video in there which makes you think about it. Yvonne's just put a reference on here that says there's a good book called The Blind Spot. Yeah, I'm aware of that, Yvonne. Thank you. That's a really good one. It's a very short read as well, but it talks about those hidden biases, those unconscious biases that people have. There are lots of resources out there available. As I say, TED Talks is actually a good one. There's the video from the RSA. Plenty of others out there. The idea is about raising our awareness, and again, I'm not suggesting for one moment as governors we need to become experts in unconscious bias, but certainly to have a little bit of an understanding. And the RSA video is probably 2 minutes and 15 seconds, something like that. It's a very short video, but that's enough to enable us to ask some of those perhaps challenging questions in our governing board meetings that we might not otherwise contemplate. And certainly it is an area that personally I think would be a very positive move if staff did receive training in this particular area.
And I think initially we were thinking here that it exists for all of us. And the first place at which we need to start is with ourselves, and recognising that this is something that is part of society, and society starts with our place in it. So beginning with our own view of the world, whichever that may be, and there'd be a wide variety of attendees' perceptions of this, and then moving on to our board, our school staff, our school community in terms of pupils and staff, pupils and their parents, and then thinking about what that might mean, therefore, when we go on to talk about other elements of preparing pupils for life in modern Britain.
Indeed, and we've got a couple of comments coming through here about distinguishing between conscious and unconscious bias. Obviously, conscious bias, everybody knows about it because it's actually, we're conscious of it and we're doing things deliberately. That's not what we're talking about at this point in time, but we will come on to that perhaps a little bit later. Let's move on at this point. As I say, we've given you quite a few slides as reference in the penultimate slide is the pack in terms of where you might want to find out more. But the question for us is really focusing on, well, what should we be doing as governing boards? What should we be doing as individual governors and trustees now? And the point about giving you the little snapshot on unconscious bias there is really to just raise awareness. But if we're aware of the issue, then what we should be thinking is, well, how can we inspire and champion change in our schools, in our trusts? If we think there's an issue, and again, I've just realised that we've had a little technical issue. There was a poll that we were going to ask you to engage in a few slides back, but for some reason that's actually frozen on my system this morning, so apologies there. But one of the things that we wanted to perhaps get you to think about in that poll was the concept that racism very often in our schools is something that doesn't touch a lot of people, but actually the point is, if it touches anybody, if anybody feels uncomfortable, if anybody feels that racism exists, then there is an obligation, a moral one, if not a statutory one, on all of us to do something about it. And I think the imperative for governors is to think about, do we know that we have an anti-racist school? Do we know that everybody understands what that means, and that we're able to talk and discuss about issues that impact on people's feelings, impact on relationships, etc.? do we regularly talk about these issues as governors? Because a lot of people see it as a taboo issue. They don't want to cause offence. They don't want to embarrass anybody. And therefore, very often, these things don't get swept under the carpet because they're not even conscious that that's happening. These are just things that don't get talked about. But of course, by thinking about change, making sure that that actually gets its place on the agenda of some of our meetings, what we then need to do as governors is actually think about, well, what are we actively doing? What are we actively doing to promote a culture of anti-racism? Because it's not enough to say we don't believe racism exists. If one single person thinks it does, that's an issue, and what we should be doing is taking a far more proactive approach to it. So our advice is that what we should be doing as governors is challenging ourselves both individually and collectively as governing boards to drive ethos and values in our schools that actually reflect not just our own context, but what we want that context to actually be. And so the whole idea of school vision, of course, comes into into focus there. And Alexander's just put a very good comment in the question box here. Alexander's saying it's good to encourage people to listen to others from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, read their books, follow them on social media. Think about who we listen to and how that influences our own thinking, etc. And yeah, absolutely agree, Alexander, and that's indeed what we're actually talking about this morning. We've got lots of other people quoting a number of different texts to us. Thank you for those. Maybe what we'll do is collect the names of some of those and perhaps post those on the website or something later. Javian has actually just put a comment on. Forgive me, I was just pausing just to make sure I understood fully what she was saying there. But Javian is actually saying, would a good place to start to ensure that alongside health and safety representation, safeguarding, etc., we should have accountability for BAME on our schools as well? Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to ensure it's meaningful. So again, just having something on an agenda from my mind isn't enough, Jovian, and I think what I would want to see is schools actively demonstrating that they're listening, they're thinking, but actually more important than that, they're actually doing something about it.
I think that's the important thing for many people following the recent events, is that there is a lot of passion, and passion for change is a great motivator. I think what we're looking at now is how do we take that passion for change and make it have an impact? What will be different in the future from what we do now? How will we make a difference for pupils and their families in the future to take their place properly in a wider society? So very much context related. Where I am chair of governors is a very village based monoculture environment. There is a completely different approach that we need to take and understand to a school which may have a very different context with a very different mix of pupils. All of those context related issues need to be represented in how do we help promote and encourage a fairer, more even, less biased society and opportunity for all of these pupils.
Indeed, and let's just move on to the next slide at that point. So in terms of what we can actually do, of course, one of the things to actually think about is provision in our own schools. When we say provision, we're talking not just about the taught curriculum, but of course some of the other aspects of the curriculum as well. But does the provision that we have at the moment as governors, can we put our hands on our hearts and say, yes, the curriculum and the provision that we have generally builds appropriate knowledge, and that we're actually using that curriculum offer to actually demonstrate to our children and young people that this is something that we're actually taking seriously? Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to move slides there. There we go. Sorry, having a few technical issues this morning. Apologies there. So, we've also got the issue, of course, that it's not just about what we teach. It's not just about the learning that we enable to actually take part. We're going to come back to the curriculum in just a few more moments. But are we actively taking steps and to actually protect our children and our young people in our schools from any overt racism that exists? Many of us actually feel that, you know, education is, and certainly the aim would be that the vast majority of schools are safe havens and actually do promote equality on a, you know, a very overt basis. But there will always be instances where overt racism does actually creep into our schools, and that's certainly something that we should and we must legally, apart from anything else, do something about. But it's those instances where perhaps, you know, it may be overt, but is it actually reported? Is it talked about? Many of you, if you've been governors for a while, will recall that back in the early days of this century, there was a statutory requirement on all schools to report racial incidents, and that was something that crept its way onto every governing body agenda. It had to be reported back to the local authority, but then nothing happened to it. I did a little bit of research over the last 48 hours just to see if I could find out if that regulation still exists, and it is nowhere on the Department for Education site anymore. But even when it did, I mean, I've been a governor myself for many years, and I think there was an element of tokenism about that. There was certainly a lack of clarity in terms of what constituted a racist incident in some schools. And some schools, I think, were probably even a little bit apprehensive about reporting them, lest it should actually have an impact on how they were judged when Ofsted came to call. So, yeah, I think we have to think about, yes, we would probably all say children in my school are safe from overt racism, but how do we know? What evidence, what data have we got to actually back that up as governors? Do we ever actively talk to children and young people in our schools about how they feel? And that's where that Channel 4 programme that Linda mentioned a few moments back, I don't know whether any of you have seen it. You can probably still watch it on catch up. It's very, very powerful. There are two episodes in it in total, but it explores a lot of those issues which are just not discussed, not just by us as adults, by also by children and young people.
And I think one of the other powerful things from that programme is when they took children to the National Portrait Gallery, getting a sense of the history of famous people that they could identify. They asked the children to find a portrait and stand by it that represented inspiration for them. And of course, there's very few pictures that don't denote white privilege in a very overt way. And how many young people have an opportunity to see people from their own culture that are successful? And it starts in their own schools. You know, how many, the percentage of people that are in leadership positions in their own society. So I think this is really important here. And of course, one of the things that that school must have done is to look at how they were going to change that, what curriculum offer they were going to provide, what trips they were going to provide. So at a very high level, there was a passion and a willingness to look further than what had been provided off the shelf for them, and to think what is appropriate for us. And this is where governors and leadership can together think about, if we really want to make a difference here, what are we going to do to adapt those things that have been given to us to make them more relevant to what we want to do, what our vision for the school and for preparing our young people for a wider society might look like and might include.
Indeed. And again, I think what we do need to think about, and again, this is, for me, is very much a continuum. And if you think about what Linda's just said, you know, if we're then, you know, listening to what children and young people are actually saying, using that as a platform to perhaps make sure that there is greater protection than there might be in some of our schools at the moment, what we're then beginning to start doing is actually identifying that any endemic prejudice that does exist in our societies and in our communities, and also think about that unconscious bias. You know, particularly, I mean, we're talking, obviously, the catalyst for today's session is very much what happened in the northern part of the United States a few weeks back now. And yes, that has actually put the spotlight once again on the black and minority ethnic community. But this is about a much broader picture than that, isn't it? This is about everybody, but it has got to be inclusive of the black and ethnic minority community, because there is that very real sense that there is some endemic prejudice and some unconscious bias that actually is making a very real difference to the lives of those people. And this isn't about anybody sitting back and saying, this is a much bigger issue than this, and I don't think it's this. If somebody thinks it's an issue, then clearly there's an imperative to actually do something about it, and that's where we're coming from as far as this session today is concerned. Question here from Kate. Kate saying, should governors be actively taking steps to ensure that the governing board reflects the demographic of the school? That's certainly an option, Kate. It's not something that we're specifically going to be tackling today, because I know that governors for schools are looking at putting a webinar on in the not too distant future specifically on that issue. So not something that we're going to be looking at directly today, I would say.
I think there
Lots
are
of
some
people.
things.
Sorry.
I was just going to say there are things boards can do themselves to make themselves more inclusive of other views generally, but we do need to make sure that we are reaching out and providing opportunities for engagement. I'm thinking particularly parental engagement and governance, or is the board seen as again an elitist group of people for which membership, if you don't fit that expectation, is not open, wouldn't even be pursued. So there are some things there, I think, that we might think about first as a board.
Absolutely, and don't forget, of course, that the board is about, any board is about collective responsibility in governance terms, and what we need to avoid is actually any kind of tokenism or any hint of tokenism. Having any individual governor from a member of any particular group, and again, doesn't have to be black, ethnic minority, it could be from a group representing any of those other protected characteristics under equalities legislation, that still does not necessarily, by its existence, mean that we are a board that is not still impacted on in our school by unconscious bias. It doesn't mean to say that we're tackling some of those issues that some of our children, young people, and dare I say our staff actually feel still do reflect a slightly prejudicial approach in the school. This is actually about culture and values that we have to understand is what we need to tackle first. Representation on a board may be one aspect of that, but the process here is about how we tackle the any potential issue that affects the entire school community. Lots of people have asked questions already about the curriculum, and I want to say a few things about the curriculum offer now. Lots has been in the media recently, and I'm not going to comment particularly on any one of these, but calls for Black British history to find its way onto the curriculum in all UK schools. Some of you will say, well, we do that as part of the curriculum in my school. Many do, but it's not universal at the moment, of course. Comment in the Independent a couple of weeks back, we should be putting colonial history on the curriculum, then we'll understand who we really are. And of course, this comes back to this notion that as a society, we don't talk about things because we find it uncomfortable to do. And there are certain things about the past of this country and how it grew up, particularly thinking now about the slave trade, etc., and what that did to the economy of this country in the past. We can't change that. That is part of their history, but that probably isn't taught to the same extent that other aspects of our history are, and that you can understand why some of those calls are coming through at the moment. Item in the Telegraph, racism isn't just a United States problem. To fight it in the UK, we need to change how it's taught in schools. I mean, I thought was a particularly thought-provoking comment. Do we actually teach children about racism? We tend to talk a lot in our schools over probably the last 20-25 years or so about tolerance and understanding. I mean, I don't like the word tolerance. I was always brought up to understand that tolerance meant that you were actually putting up with something, tolerating it, whether you agreed with it or not. What we want to do is get to a stage where we're embracing difference. We're not actually making difference a big issue. We're actually embracing that and saying, actually, we are all part of one society here, and racism doesn't have any part of that. UK children have targeted black children for generations. The education system's overdue for a reckoning. Slightly more challenging comment coming there, but again, coming back to this point, how do we, through our schools, ensure that some of those stereotypical thoughts, some of those practices, some of that endemic prejudice is actually being challenged and hopefully done away with as a result of experiences in schools? And Michael Rosen here, who many of you will be aware is sorry, I'm not quite sure what's happening with my machine this morning. Quite a prolific commentator on the education system. Say he's been off the scene for a while because unfortunately he had COVID-19 or was in hospital for a long time. But he's actually put a blog out last week where he's specifically talking about what's happening in our schools at the moment, subsequent to the events in the United States, and he's actually criticising the teaching of British values. The government's approach back in 2005, 2006 was to re-establish the idea of British values being a core part of the curriculum. Okay, then it was actually very much in terms of the prevent duty and the anti-radicalisation agenda. British values isn't new to the curriculum. It's been implied there since the year 2000, but do they go far enough is the question that Michael Rosen's asking in terms of shaping that curriculum so it really does make people think. And again, I mean, calling the British values I think is slightly controversial. The values that are being talked about here are values that hopefully any civilized society would hold relatively dear anyway. Comment from Sue here. Sue's just saying, can you please remind me of the name of the Channel 4 programme? Yes, Linda, remind me, it was called The School That Ended Racism.
Yeah, I'll double check for you and I'll look that up for you. And it's something like The School That Tried to Change Racism. But I'll just double check that and come back to you if I may, Steve.
Lovely, thank you. Oops. Okay, so just a few things to think about on that subject of the curriculum. Obviously, the national curriculum for history is set. It's set at government level, and the exam born syllabuses actually represent that. They are not going to change overnight. So, although there's a lot of there's a lot of space being taken up in the media at the moment by calls to actually change the curriculum, that may well happen over time, but it's not going to happen quickly. So, I think one of the things that we need to think about and consider as governors is what are the other opportunities for us? What are the other areas of the curriculum or other opportunities for children and young people to learn in our schools where perhaps more immediate, shorter term change could actually come about? Now, forgive me, these next few bullet points are very much smattered with abbreviations, but hopefully most of you will be familiar with them. PSHE, Personal, Social and Health Education. And circle time, which is what it's called, very often in lower end of primary education. But what are those sorts of conversations that we have with children about the different characteristics represented in school, about the context of our school? Do we ever ask different people what they mean? What they think rather of different aspects based on perhaps their colour or their creed or any other characteristics? Those are the sorts of things that perhaps can make a difference here, because one of the biggest criticisms that I can see is coming out at the moment is that people are afraid to talk. There's this big taboo about tackling the idea that racism exists, and if we want to be seen to be anti-racism, we have to explore what racism means. How does racism actually make people feel? What impact does that have on them? What impact does that have on us as a society? SMSC, Spiritual, Moral, Social and Cultural Education. Again, this is where British values historically has probably been threaded through certainly a significant part of the curriculum, but this would come through through the teaching of RE, through assemblies, daily acts of collective worship, etc. But Lots of other opportunities in secondary schools, for example. There's very often form time or class time at the start of a day, thoughts for the week, all of those sorts of things. And yes, there might be, well, we do have a thought for the week in Black History Week, etc. The kind of question we should be asking as government, is that enough? Just one isolated topic amongst perhaps 38 others in the school year, is that enough, or are there other opportunities that we could seize on, particularly at the moment? We're not having big assemblies, etc. right now, but there are opportunities for conversations to take place. There are opportunities to actually inspire children and young people to think. But are we taking those often enough in our schools at the moment? RSE, the new relationship section, there should be an H in there for health education as well. Statutory from September this year. Lots of schools have actually changed their curriculum offering. They've changed their curriculum planning to reflect the new requirements. The announcement last week from the DfE has put the implementation date back to summer term 2021. But notwithstanding that, where does the idea of anti-racism actually come into that? Are we talking about the role that race can play in how children and young people form relationships, sexual or otherwise, but form relationships so that they can live productive, healthy, safe lives, etc. Sorry, let's start it again. Apologies. Assemblies, as we say, are not probably taking part in terms of whole schools, taking place rather in terms of whole school assemblies, although some schools will be doing that virtually over the internet, etc. But they also are opportunities where schools can talk about current affairs, topics in the media at the moment, and certainly use them as an opportunity to give some thinking time and to be thought-provoking to children and young people in schools and staff as well, of course. And class discussions too. Do we know, are there opportunities for real speaking and listening to take place? Because it's one thing to talk to people, and I'm very conscious that Linda and I are talking to you this morning, but there are some questions coming through, which is lovely. But do we actually give children, young people and staff in schools the opportunity for that kind of discourse, that opportunity to have a two-way discussion where there's a lot of listening going on as well as some talking? And when we put all of those things together as governors, does that give us a plan for change? Does that give us an agenda that can actually be taken forward?
And I think that's that impetus for change that I mentioned earlier, is if we feel strongly about this now, and we've been reminded that terrible things happen if we forget about it, then what do we need to do to make something different in the future? Because it's the responsibility of each of us to reflect on our own context, our own sphere of influence, and then look at what needs to happen next to keep this agenda alive and moving in the right direction.
An interesting comment here from Sean, which I guess is what one of those blockers, one of those barriers that an awful lot of us will come across. And Sean's making the point: what we need to do is combat that common response. We treat everyone the same here, and I think you're absolutely right, Sean. And I think that's that is one of the issues. And even if we think we treat everybody else the same, does everybody believe that they're treated the same? And actually, is treating people the same enough? Should we be treating some people differently? Because we need to actually ensure that they feel fairly treated, because treating everyone the same isn't always an appropriate way to move forward. Couple of questions coming through about all of this needs to be done in an age-appropriate way. Yeah, absolutely it does, and certainly from a teaching, from a support perspective in schools, there are there's a plethora of information and resources available out there that schools have actually got access to, and they are all done in a very age-appropriate way. And of course, teachers are creating their own resources all of the time. But there are lots of materials that schools have access to, from preschool, nursery, right the way up to post-16. And of course, if we're thinking, just coming back for a moment, just in terms of the role that governors have in terms of protecting pupils from overt racism, we have to, regardless of whether we, the duty to report racial incidents, and again, that for me wasn't ever terribly effective anyway, but does our school collect data? Are we aware of bullying in our schools? Are we aware of the difference it makes and how that is actually impacting on different groups of pupils? Have we got strategies in place to actually engage with bullies as well as victims so that we're tackling some of those deep-rooted prejudices that sadly some of our children actually learn in other aspects of their lives? How are we providing for the training for teachers and other staffs to actually make them identify potential overt and sometimes covert racism in our schools? And what do our values systems say? All of our schools probably now, actually more than ever, say, "Oh yes, we're very concerned with promoting values. That's what our vision is actually all about now." But as governors, do we ever reflect on what the ethos of our schools says about it? Does the ethos mean the same to every single pupil, every member of staff in our schools, as we think it means as governors? How do we ever test that out? Um, just wanted to, lots of people have put comments on the question block this morning, and apologies if I can't get to every single one of you by name. We would normally try and do that, but there are lots and lots of you here this morning. But lots of people asking about staff. There is an issue, I think, in an awful lot of our schools. Many staff from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds don't think that they've had the same opportunities as others, etc. What are the expectations we have of those staff? But what are the expectations we have generally as a school that actually go right the way across our school community? Staff, pupils, parents, and those of us in governance. Is there any bias that actually creeps into some of the decisions that we make when it comes to promoting staff, when it comes to giving pupils responsibilities in schools, positions in school productions, etc.? How do we treat our parents? And as we've said before, how diverse is governance in our school? And all of this comes down to, if you like, that position that says, this isn't about me being able to say I'm not a racist. Hopefully we can all say that, but this is about me questioning myself and saying, am I actively involved in promoting anti-racism? Because the only way we'll ever change our school systems is as governors if we take that stance that this isn't about demonstrating we're not racist, this is about actively promoting anti-racism in our schools. And of course, one of the other key things to do, as we keep coming back to, is about tackling this taboo. It might be uncomfortable to talk about, it might be slightly embarrassing, and we might be fearful of embarrassing others and actually making them feel uncomfortable. But that's a taboo that we've actually imposed on ourselves. We should talk about how people feel with regard to racism and to anti-racism. We should focus on those issues that are separating different groups within our school communities and our wider communities at the moment. And of course, that brings us back to this point at the bottom of this list of bullet points here. It's about having an attitude or a mentality that says we focus on what brings us together rather than what sets us apart.
I think when you take all of these bullet points together, this idea about creating a safe space for positive discussion to take place, it does need to be managed quite carefully within school. So being supportive of staff to understand and create a safe place for them to talk about their feelings and increasing their knowledge and being confident and competent to talk about issues of race and gender and all of those other things within the RSE curriculum that you've already mentioned, being aware of the context of your own school, and then opening up conversations between pupils in the various different places that we've already talked about within the curriculum that those opportunities arise, but for young people to feel that they can say things that they are feeling in a place that is safe and a place which will help to inform and develop their understanding of the world from possibly some confusion about some of those elements, or some being unaware of some of the issues that feed into where we find ourselves in society from the past. So all of these things come together in saying there are differences. We know there are differences. What brings us together is this joint approach of safety and passion for making the world better for all of us, but particularly for those who have had disadvantage thrust upon them from an unconscious bias point of view.
Okay, and just a couple of articles I would very, very briefly talk about this. I'm aware that time is moving on. Giving you the links here. Top article is actually written by a governor in a school in southwest London. Very powerful article talking about racism, and there's no denying it exists. So again, the imperative is actually we act and make sure that as governors we're actually doing something about it. Easy read. He came out in School Week a couple of weeks back, and similarly a blog that I found on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, which I also found incredibly powerful. This is from an ex-head teacher who talks about this whole issue of taboo and how he got a letter as a result of what happened in the States a couple of weeks back from an ex-pupil, and exploring all of those ideas. Well, why didn't we talk about this? Why was it embarrassing, etc.? And they're just great thought-provoking articles. If you're moved to do anything as a consequence of today's session, I would suggest have a look at both of these, share them with head teachers, share them with members of leadership teams in your school, etc., because I think they're very powerful. I also hope that they're thought-provoking as well. You might think it's slightly strange to actually talk about Blue Peter, which is what this actually represents, but this is a short video I'd just like to show you now.
No doubt some of you noticed that in the news at the moment there have been protests and marches around the world that started in America, and these are because of racism. Now, racism is to have a bad opinion of someone simply because of something that they can't even help, which is the colour of their skin. Being of mixed heritage, I've suffered from it far too many times in the past.
Well, sadly, I've experienced racism too, and it makes me feel really upset that somebody would dislike me or think negatively about me because of my skin color, which, like Richie said, is something that I have no control over whatsoever. People should not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, lots of you may have heard people saying Black Lives Matter, and that's not to say that all lives don't matter, but it is to say that racism right now is affecting Black lives all over the world.
Unlike Richie and Mwaxi, racism is something that I've never experienced. It's something I've learned about and read about and heard about, but I've never actually had to go through it. And when upsetting, uncomfortable stuff like this is happening around us, it's really important to remember that you don't need to have all the answers, but it's really, really important at the moment, now more than ever, that we educate ourselves, we speak out and use our voices, and we try to understand. That is key, because at the moment, listening and learning are our most powerful tools. I'm standing here and I understand that we all need to do better. I'm talking about me, about you, us on and off camera. We all need to do a better job, and we need to stand together, because this affects all of us. Racism affects all of us, and it's something that we need to fight as a team.
I'll be honest, it's not something that I ever thought I would have to discuss on Blue Peter. However, it underlines just how important it is. Now, if you're upset or worried about anything that we've spoken about, please reach out to a grown-up and talk to them. Newsround have been phenomenal. Jump on their website. There is plenty of information and advice for you as well. Now, as we've said, this is very, very important. So we really, really appreciate your attention to this. Thank you, Blue Peter fans.
Again, I don't know what you think. I think that's actually really powerful. Yeah, how many youngsters actually watch Blue Peter, it doesn't actually matter. It's the message that comes across there, I think, is actually a very strong one. And the idea is that this should actually make us as governors think about, I wonder if those messages could actually be replayed in our school. I don't mean the video, well, that's an opportunity, of course, but yeah, have we thought about it in that? And if three, reasonably young Blue Peter presenters can articulate it as succinctly as that, why can't we talk about it in our schools? Because actually that's part of the problem that we have here, it would appear. Just want to move on We're getting near the end of the session now, and I've got, again, 3 quotes here. And as I've said right from the beginning of the webinar today, what Linda and I wanted to do in this webinar is just to get you to think about some of the issues here and think about some of the actions that you might take. And these are 3 quotes that, again, I found just from playing around and surfing on the internet in the last few weeks or so. First of all, Will Smith on that, racism's not getting worse, it's getting filmed. Now, when I first saw that, well, that's an odd thing to say, but actually, is it true? Are we thinking more about it because everybody has a mobile phone? It would appear now everybody films everything that goes on in lives. We know more about what happens. Clearly, there's a thought behind that. There's a strand behind that. But actually, the fact that we are filming these issues, the issues are still there to be filmed, and I think that's the serious message coming out of this. I think the quote from Barack Obama is actually a very interesting one as well. Yeah, Black Lives Matter simply refers to the notion that there's no specific vulnerability that there's a specific vulnerability that needs to be addressed. It's not meant to suggest that others don't matter. It's meant to suggest that other folks aren't experiencing this particular vulnerability. And again, the other folks reference there, if we don't talk about it, if we don't talk about it to our staff, if we don't talk about feelings of our staff, our pupils, how will we ever know? How will we know about those vulnerabilities in our communities? And then again, this last one is an American author, and I have to say I wrote it down somewhere because I always forget her name. Apologies, but I do like this quote. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And again, I like that one because again, that comes back to this notion that the unconscious bias is something that sits within all of us. It's something that you have to fight to actually do something about. It is a question of thinking about how everybody that we come into contact with, relies upon what's happened to them in the past, on their cultural background, on their own cultural environment at this point in time, but also on those experiences that shape all of us. And unless we hold the mirror up to ourselves, unless we sometimes actually point that out to other people, we're never truly going to get to to the bottom of some of these issues that are blighting our societies at the moment. That's all Linda and I wanted to say this morning, folks, other than if there are any other questions. We have a couple of moments left, and I've got a couple on the board at this moment in time. Sean has actually said that the No Outsiders scheme that was developed in Birmingham is primarily about racism and multiculturalism, and has made some difference there. Thank you for that one, Sean.
And I think what we are not promoting a particular way or a particular method or a particular curriculum. What we're saying is that as board members, you are best placed to think about this at a strategic level, and then it is for you with your school leaders to think about what this means in practice for your school, because there is not a one size fits all. Each of us, and the various questions that you've asked will come from the point at which you sit as a board or a school or a community or an individual. And it's very important that those decisions, what happens next, is based on that context, that understanding, that drive, that vision for what might need to be different. So we're not promoting a one way, we're just asking you to think a little bit more deeply about this subject at this moment in time, and then to look at what actions might be necessary to take it forward and make it better.
Absolutely. Couple of comments here from Mona. Mona's made 2 very pertinent comments, actually. What is more powerful to me is that when I was a child, Blue Peter presenters were universally white. I would absolutely agree with that, Mona. That has changed over the last 10 years or so now, and I think looking at that clip of the presenters now is very different. And I think Mona then goes on to make another comment. Diversity now is far more normalised. I think that is absolutely true. The reality is all of our children, all of our young people in Britain today are going to grow up in a country, in a society that is probably far more diverse than the one that we as adults grew up in. What we're talking about today is how do we make sure that we go beyond tolerance, we go to a society where diversity is just another thing that actually makes us part of a divergent society. It's something that actually is celebrated rather than something that's actually used as a cause for vilifying people. I don't see any other questions coming through. We've got lots of very nice comments, so thank you very much for all those nice comments that have come in this morning, folks. We do hope that you've actually found the webinar helpful. We hope it's been thought-provoking. That was what we set out to do. Some references there for the documents that we have actually referred to, other than those two articles in the media I referred to a little bit earlier. And just to say thank you very much indeed for joining us on this webinar today. We do hope you found it of some benefit. Do look out for future webinars on governors for schools, not just from us as Better Governor, but also from other partners of Governors for Schools. If you wouldn't mind taking a few moments to complete the very short evaluation feedback form, it's just got 4 very quick questions on it that will come up immediately after the webinar. Governors for Schools and we would be very grateful, so thank you very much for that. And just say enjoy the rest of your days, and thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning.